Hey guys, tonight we begin with a forbidden fruit that would shock you, but not for the reasons you might think. Did you know the banana you had for breakfast would have been completely inedible just a few centuries ago? What if I told you most fruits and vegetables in medieval times were practically weapons rather than food? The truth about medieval produce hides a mystery few have uncovered. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself transported back to medieval Europe, perhaps the 12th century. You're hungry after a long day of toiling in the fields or working your trade. You reach for what you think will be a sweet, delicious apple pines, the kind you're used to in the modern world. But what you bite into instead is small, hard, and so sour it makes your face contort. This isn't a bad apple. This is what all apples were like. The crisp, sweet varieties you know today. They simply didn't exist. The medieval diet was dramatically different from our own, and nowhere is this more evident than in the fruits and vegetables people consumed. Today we take for granted the colorful bounty found in our grocery stores, plump tomatoes, sweet carrots, juicy oranges, but in medieval times, produce was often barely recognizable compared to its modern descendants. Let's start with perhaps the most dramatic transformation, the humble watermelon. When you picture a watermelon, you likely imagine a large green-striped fruit with bright red sweet flesh and small black seeds scattered throughout. Now, I want you to erase that image entirely. The watermelons of medieval times weren't just slightly different, they were almost entirely different fruits. In a 17th century painting by Italian artist Giovanni Stanchi, which is the earliest known depiction of a watermelon cut open, we see something startling. Instead of the uniform red flesh we're familiar with, the medieval watermelon's interior was pale, with 6 triangular sections of swirled seedy pulp. The red portions were minimal and segmented, almost web-like in appearance. The rind was thicker, the seeds considerably larger, and most importantly, the flavor was nothing like today's sweet treat. Medieval watermelons were likely bitter and tough, with a texture more akin to a cucumber than the juicy delight we enjoy at summer picnics. They originated in Africa, where they were first cultivated around 5,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. But those early watermelons were barely 2 inches in diameter, about the size of a tennis ball. The flesh was tough, pale, and bitter. Not exactly something you'd look forward to on a hot summer day. What's perhaps most fascinating is that watermelons weren't initially cultivated for their sweetness or flavor at all. Their primary value lay in their water content. In arid regions like ancient Egypt, watermelons provided a reliable source of clean hydration, essentially serving as natural canteens. The fruit's thick rind meant it could be stored for relatively long periods without spoiling, making it an essential resource for desert travel and sustenance during droughts. But wait, you might be wondering, if medieval watermelons were so unappetizing, how did we get from that pale, bitter fruit to the sweet red slices we enjoy today? The answer reveals one of humanity's most underappreciated accomplishments: selective breeding. For thousands of years, farmers and cultivators have been intentionally breeding plants with desirable traits. When they found a watermelon plant that produced slightly sweeter fruit or slightly redder flesh, they would collect its seeds and plant them, hoping these favorable characteristics would appear in the next generation. Over centuries of this careful selection, watermelons gradually transformed from bitter, seedy survival food into the sweet summer treat we recognize today. But the watermelon's transformation is hardly unique. Nearly every fruit and vegetable you're familiar with has undergone a similar evolution, some even more dramatic. And perhaps none more surprising than the fruit that likely sits in your kitchen right now. The banana is particularly fascinating because the difference between wild bananas and modern cultivated varieties is so stark that you might not even recognize them as the same fruit. Wild bananas from which our modern varieties descend are stubby, seedy nightmares that would make your morning smoothie preparation a laborious and ultimately disappointing task. Wild-type bananas like Musa acuminata are filled with large, hard seeds that occupy most of the fruit's interior. The actual edible flesh, it makes up a tiny percentage of the fruit's volume, perhaps as little as 5% in some varieties. Imagine trying to eat around dozens of stone-like seeds just to get a small taste of banana flesh. The experience would be more frustrating than satisfying. Another wild banana variety, Musa bulbiciana, offers a similarly challenging experience. It's starchier, less sweet, and harder to access than even the seediest modern banana you might occasionally encounter. If you were to plant one of these wild bananas in the ground, you'd have a decent chance of growing a new banana plant. Try that with a modern Cavendish banana, the variety most commonly found in supermarkets today, and you'll end up with nothing but a rotting fruit. That's because modern bananas are essentially sterile. They've been bred to be seedless, which makes them ideal for human consumption, but renders them incapable of natural reproduction. Commercial banana plants are propagated through cuttings rather than seeds. They're essentially clones. Every Cavendish banana you've ever eaten is genetically identical to every other Cavendish banana in the world. This seedlessness is the result of thousands of years of careful selection. Ancient farmers in Southeast Asia, where bananas originated, would have identified rare naturally occurring banana plants with fewer seeds and propagated them, gradually developing varieties with more flesh and fewer seeds. The process continued over generations, eventually led to the development of seedless varieties that could only be propagated through human intervention. The bananas we enjoy today are a technological achievement, not a natural one. They're the result of human ingenuity and millennia of agricultural experimentation. And yet we rarely stop to appreciate this incredible transformation while peeling our perfectly seedless breakfast fruit. If the dramatic differences between medieval and modern watermelons and bananas have piqued your curiosity, you might be wondering about other common fruits and vegetables. Did they all undergo such radical transformations? The answer in most cases is a resounding yes. Let's explore another startling example. Corn. Corn, or maize as it's known in much of the world, is perhaps the most dramatic example of human-directed evolution in our food supply. If you could hold an ear of modern corn next to its ancient ancestor, you might struggle to believe they're even related. The ancestor of modern corn is a plant called teosinte, which still grows wild in parts of Mexico and Central America. But if you're picturing something that looks like a small corn cob, you'd be mistaken. Teosinte bears almost no resemblance to modern corn. Instead of a substantial cob packed with hundreds of juicy kernels, teosinte produces a thin stalk with just 5 to 12 kernels. And each kernel is enclosed in a rock-hard casing that's nearly impossible to breach without specialized tools or techniques. Imagine trying to make a meal from teosinte. You'd spend more energy trying to access the tiny amount of nutrition inside those hard shells than you'd gain from eating it. The kernels themselves were smaller, starchier, and far less sweet than modern corn. They weren't yellow or white like today's varieties, but likely a much darker, almost black color. So why did ancient Mesoamericans bother domesticating such an unpromising plant? The answer likely lies in teosinte's resilience. It could grow in conditions where other plants struggled, making it a valuable resource in times of scarcity. Over thousands of years, through careful selection and cultivation, indigenous farmers transformed this tough, barely edible grass into one of the world's most important food crops. The domestication of corn began around 9,000 years ago in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico. Those early farmers selected teosinte plants with favorable characteristics, perhaps those with slightly larger kernels or softer shells. Over generations, this selective breeding led to dramatic changes in the plant's architecture and yield. Modern corn bears so little resemblance to teosinte that early botanists struggled to identify corn's wild ancestor. It took sophisticated genetic analysis to confirm the relationship. The transformation from Teosinte to modern corn represents one of the most remarkable achievements in agricultural history, and it happened without any understanding of genetics or modern breeding techniques, just through careful observation and patience across countless human generations. The story of corn's transformation serves as a powerful reminder that the foods we take for granted are not gifts from nature, but the result of thousands of years of human innovation and effort. When you bite into a buttery corn on the cob at your next summer barbecue, you're enjoying the culmination of one of humanity's longest-running experiments. Let's turn our attention now to another staple of the modern diet that would have been virtually unrecognizable in medieval times: the carrot. Today's carrots are predominantly orange, uniformly shaped, and sweetly crunchy. But if you could travel back to medieval Europe and pull a carrot from the ground, you'd likely be startled by what you found. Medieval carrots weren't orange at all. They were purple, white, or occasionally yellow. The familiar orange carrot that dominates supermarket shelves today didn't emerge until the 16th and 17th centuries, and its widespread adoption has a surprisingly political origin story that we'll explore shortly. Before modern breeding, carrots were thin, woody, and often forked or branched rather than the smooth, uniform shape we expect today. Their flavor was more bitter and less sweet, and their texture was fibrous and tough. Medieval carrots were primarily grown for their aromatic tops and seeds, which were used in cooking as herbs. The roots themselves were secondary in importance. Wild carrots, also known as Queen Anne's lace, produce thin, pale roots that bear little resemblance to their cultivated descendants. These wild roots are edible but hardly worth the effort of harvesting. They're bitter, woody, and contain minimal nutrition compared to modern varieties. So how did we get from these humble beginnings to today's sweet orange vegetables? The story involves a fascinating blend of horticultural science and political symbolism. The orange carrot as we know it today is widely believed to have been developed by Dutch growers in the 16th century. They selectively bred yellow carrots to produce increasingly orange varieties, supposedly as a tribute to William of Orange, who led the struggle for Dutch independence. Whether the political motivation behind orange carrots is historically accurate or merely a colorful legend, what's certain is that these new varieties had advantages beyond their vibrant hue. They contained higher levels of beta-carotene, making them more nutritious. They were sweeter, more uniform, and less woody than their medieval predecessors. These improvements made orange carrots increasingly popular throughout Europe, eventually displacing the purple, white, and yellow varieties that had dominated for centuries. The transformation of the carrot from a tough, bitter root to a sweet, nutritious staple is yet another example of how selective breeding has dramatically altered our food supply. It's a process that continued through the centuries and accelerated with the development of modern agricultural science. Speaking of vegetables that have undergone radical transformations, let's discuss one of the most surprising examples, one that's not about a single vegetable, but rather an entire family of them. Did you know that cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, and kohlrabi are all the same species? That's right, these diverse vegetables are all cultivars of Brassica oleracea, commonly known as wild cabbage. Wild cabbage is a leafy plant native to the coastal areas of the Mediterranean region. It doesn't look much like any of its domesticated descendants. It has thick, leathery leaves and a strong, bitter taste, an adaptation that helps protect it from salt spray and grazing animals in its harsh native habitat. From this unpromising starting point, ancient farmers created an amazing diversity of vegetables through selective breeding. Each familiar brassica vegetable represents human selection for different plant parts. Kale was developed by selecting for plants with large, tender leaves. Cabbage was created by breeding for terminal buds, the growing tips at the top of the plant, creating the dense, wrapped heads we're familiar with. Brussels sprouts were developed by selecting for enlarged lateral buds, the small growing points along the sides of the plant's stem. Broccoli was created by breeding for immature flower clusters. Cauliflower represents selection for aberrant flower growth, resulting in the dense white curd we eat. Kohlrabi was developed by selecting for an enlarged stem. All these distinct vegetables, with their different appearances, textures, and culinary uses, are the same species. They've simply been bred to emphasize different parts of the plant's anatomy. It's as if humans identified an animal and then selectively bred it to create one variant with enormous ears, another with a giant nose, another with massive feet, and so on. This diversity shows the remarkable plasticity of plant forms under human selection. Medieval Europeans wouldn't recognize most of these vegetables in their modern forms. Brussels sprouts, for example, weren't developed until the late Middle Ages, and they wouldn't become widely cultivated until much later. Broccoli wasn't well known in England until the 18th century, and cauliflower didn't become popular in European cuisine until around the 16th century. The vegetables that medieval people did consume from this family, primarily cabbages and kale, would have been tougher, more fibrous, and considerably more bitter than the varieties we enjoy today. They required long cooking to become palatable, often being boiled with other ingredients to mask their harsh flavors. The story of Brassica oleracea transformation into multiple distinct vegetables is a testament to human creativity and agricultural ingenuity. It's also a reminder that our familiar foods are not static entities, but rather the products of an ongoing relationship between humans and plants, one that continues to evolve today. Let's explore another fruit that medieval people would barely recognize: the eggplant. Today's eggplants are large, glossy purple fruits with soft, mild flesh, but their ancestors tell a very different story. The eggplant was first domesticated in India, where wild varieties can still be found. These wild eggplants bear almost no resemblance to their modern descendants. They're small, round fruits about the size of grapes or cherries. Instead of deep purple, they're typically green or yellow. And unlike the mild flavor of modern eggplants, wild varieties are intensely bitter and filled with hard seeds. In fact, the name eggplant itself comes from early European varieties that were small, white, and egg-shaped, nothing like the elongated purple vegetables we're familiar with today. These early cultivated varieties were still considerably more bitter than modern eggplants, containing higher levels of compounds called alkaloids that give wild eggplants their unpleasant taste. For centuries, eggplants were viewed with suspicion in Europe. They were thought to cause fever, epilepsy, and even insanity. The Italian name for eggplant, melanzana, derives from mela insana, or mad apple, reflecting these concerns. This reputation wasn't entirely unfounded. Eggplants are members of the nightshade family, related to deadly plants like belladonna, and containing some of the same compounds, albeit in much lower concentrations. It took centuries of careful breeding to transform the small, bitter wild eggplant into the large, mild vegetable we know today. Farmers selected for plants that produced larger fruits with fewer seeds and less bitterness. This process gradually reduced the eggplant's natural defenses against being eaten, its bitterness and toxicity, making it more palatable for human consumption. Modern eggplants bear so little resemblance to their wild ancestors that you might struggle to identify them as relatives. The dramatic change in size, color, and flavor is yet another testament to the power of selective breeding to transform plants according to human preferences. Now, let's consider a fruit that's become synonymous with healthy eating but would have been unrecognizable to medieval Europeans: the apple. While apples have been cultivated for thousands of years, the sweet, crisp varieties we enjoy today are relatively recent developments. Medieval apples were smaller, sourer, and more astringent than modern varieties. They were closer in flavor and texture to crab apples, suitable mainly for cooking or making cider rather than eating raw. The flesh was often tough and fibrous, and the flavor varied wildly from tree to tree. This variability occurs because apples don't breed true from seed. If you plant a seed from a Honeycrisp apple, the resulting tree won't produce Honeycrisp apples. Instead, it will produce a completely new variety, likely reverting to characteristics closer to wild apples: small, tart, and astringent. For this reason, All modern apple varieties are maintained through grafting, a technique where a branch from a desirable tree is attached to the rootstock of another tree. This allows the desirable variety to be propagated without genetic variation. The practice of grafting has been known since ancient times, but it wasn't widely applied to fruit trees in medieval Europe. Instead, medieval orchards were often planted from seed, resulting in highly variable fruits. Occasionally, a tree would randomly produce superior apples, and cultivators would attempt to propagate these more desirable varieties. But without modern understanding of genetics or widespread use of grafting techniques, maintaining consistent quality was challenging. The sweet, crisp eating apples we take for granted today are largely the product of intensive breeding programs in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Varieties like Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, and Granny Smith were all developed through careful selection and breeding. They're not natural products but human creations. So, when you bite into a juicy sweet apple, you're enjoying the fruits of centuries of horticultural science and careful selection, not something medieval people would recognize as the same fruit they knew. Let's turn our attention now to one of the most important grain crops in human history, wheat. The bread you enjoy today would have tasted dramatically different in medieval times, and part of that difference stems from the wheat itself. Modern wheat varieties are the result of thousands of years of selection for desirable traits. Compared to their wild ancestors, they produce larger grains with higher yields and specific qualities suited to different types of baking. But medieval wheat was much closer to its wild relatives. Wild wheat has several characteristics that make it challenging to harvest and process. The mature seed head shatters easily, meaning the grains fall to the ground as soon as they ripen. A great adaptation for natural seed dispersal, but terrible for farmers trying to harvest a crop. The grains are also tightly enclosed in tough, inedible husks that are difficult to remove. Early domesticated wheat varieties, including those grown in medieval times, were improvements over wild wheat but still far from modern varieties. They had reduced shattering and were somewhat easier to thresh, but yields were much lower than today's crops. Medieval wheat fields might produce just a quarter of the grain per acre that modern fields do. The flour produced from medieval wheat was coarser and contained more bran and germ, making it more nutritious in some ways but less suitable for light, fluffy breads. The gluten content and quality also differed from modern wheat, affecting the texture of baked goods. Bread made from medieval flour would have been denser, darker, and chewier than modern bread. It often contained other grains like rye and barley, not just for flavor but out of necessity. Wheat was expensive, and stretching it with cheaper grains was common practice. Furthermore, medieval bread often contained unintentional ingredients. The stone grinding process used to make flour frequently introduced tiny rock particles into the mix. These abrasive bits gradually wore down the teeth of those who consumed bread regularly, a phenomenon archaeologists can observe in medieval skeletons. The transformation of wheat from its wild form to modern varieties represents one of the longest-running and most important plant breeding projects in human history. Without these improvements, feeding today's global population would be impossible. Next, let's explore a vegetable that medieval Europeans wouldn't have known at all, but which has become a staple of modern cooking. The tomatoes are native to South and Central America and weren't introduced to Europe until after Columbus's voyages to the Americas in the late 15th century. When tomatoes first arrived in Europe, they looked quite different from the varieties we're familiar with today. Early European tomatoes were small, often yellow, hence the Italian name pomodoro or golden apple, and considerably less fleshy than modern varieties. They were also viewed with great suspicion. As members of the nightshade family, related to known poisonous plants like deadly nightshade belladonna, tomatoes were initially considered dangerous. This fear wasn't entirely misplaced. The leaves and stems of tomato plants are indeed toxic. Additionally, when acidic tomatoes were served on pewter plates, which was common among the wealthy, the acid could leach lead from the metal, causing lead poisoning. This reinforced the belief that tomatoes themselves were poisonous. For decades after their introduction to Europe, tomatoes were grown primarily as ornamental plants, admired for their unusual appearance, but rarely eaten. It wasn't until the late 17th and 18th centuries that tomatoes began to be widely accepted as food in European cuisines. The transformation of tomatoes from small, suspicious fruits to the large, diverse varieties we enjoy today is a relatively recent development in agricultural history. Modern breeding has given us tomatoes optimized for different uses: meaty Roma tomatoes for sauce, firm slicing tomatoes for sandwiches, tiny cherry tomatoes for salads. We have varieties in red, yellow, orange, purple, and even striped patterns, a diversity that would astonish those first Europeans who cautiously regarded the golden apples from the New World. The tomato's journey from feared ornamental to essential ingredient represents a different kind of transformation than the other fruits and vegetables we've discussed. Not just physical changes through breeding, but a complete cultural reassessment of its value and safety. Let's now consider a fruit that was rare and precious in medieval Europe, but has become commonplace today. The orange. The sweet oranges we're familiar with didn't exist in medieval Europe. Instead, bitter oranges, which are essentially inedible raw, were occasionally available to the wealthy as ingredients for cooking, medicine, and perfume. Sweet oranges were developed in China and didn't reach Europe until the late 15th or early 16th century, brought by Portuguese traders. Even then, they remained luxury items accessible only to the wealthy. Oranges were so valuable that they were sometimes given as special Christmas gifts in northern European countries where they couldn't be grown. The orange varieties available in those early days were less sweet, seedier, and had thicker, bumpier rinds than modern oranges. They were difficult to peel and often had a tart flavor alongside their sweetness. The development of consistently sweet, easy-to-peel varieties with minimal seeds is largely a product of modern breeding programs. In fact, many familiar citrus fruits are recent developments. Seedless navel oranges originated from a single mutant tree discovered in Brazil in the 19th century. Clementines, a type of mandarin orange, prized for being seedless and easy to peel, were first bred in Algeria around 1900. Blood oranges, with their dramatic crimson flesh, were likely developed in Sicily sometime after sweet oranges arrived in Europe. Medieval Europeans might have occasionally seen or tasted bitter oranges, but the sweet, juicy fruits we take for granted would have seemed miraculous to them. Exotic treasures rather than everyday snacks. Another dramatic transformation in our food supply involves the humble potato. While potatoes weren't known in medieval Europe, they're native to South America and weren't introduced to Europe until the 16th century. Their story illustrates how dramatically human selection can change a plant in a relatively short time. Wild potatoes, which still grow in the Andes, are small often no bigger than a marble. They contain high levels of toxic compounds called glycolloids, which can cause headaches, diarrhea, and even death in high concentrations. Indigenous peoples in the Andes developed sophisticated methods to detoxify wild potatoes, including freezing, drying, and processing them with clay that absorbed the toxic compounds. Even the earliest domesticated potatoes were smaller, more bitter, and contained higher levels of glycolloids than modern varieties. Over centuries of cultivation, indigenous farmers in the Andes selected potatoes with lower toxicity, better flavor, and larger size. When potatoes were first introduced to Europe, they faced considerable resistance. They were suspected of causing leprosy, syphilis, and various other ailments. They were grown as ornamental plants for their pretty flowers before they were accepted as food. Even then, only the tubers were eaten. The leaves, stems, and fruits of potato plants are indeed toxic. Modern potatoes represent a remarkable achievement in plant breeding. They've been selected for reduced toxicity, increased size, improved flavor, and various culinary qualities like starchiness or waxiness. Different varieties have been developed for specific uses, some ideal for baking, others for mashing, still others for frying into chips or French fries. The transformation of the potato from a small toxic tuber to a safe, versatile staple food has had profound effects on human history, enabling population growth and changing agricultural practices across Europe and beyond. Let's now consider a fruit that's undergone a particularly dramatic transformation, the strawberry. Medieval strawberries were entirely different from the large, juicy fruits we enjoy today. They were tiny, about the size of your fingernail, and grew wild in forests rather than being actively cultivated. These wild strawberries, Fragaria vesca, had intense flavor despite their small size, but gathering enough for a substantial serving was time-consuming. They bruised easily and had almost no shelf life, making them impractical for commerce. The modern garden strawberry, Fragaria garch and anassa, didn't exist until the 18th century. It's actually a hybrid between two American species that were brought to Europe, the Virginia strawberry from North America and the Chilean strawberry from South America. This accidental hybridization created a larger, more robust fruit that could be commercially cultivated. Even these early hybrid strawberries were much smaller than today's varieties. Intensive breeding, particularly over the last century, has given us strawberries that can be 20 times larger than their wild ancestors. Modern varieties have been selected for size, sweetness, firmness for shipping, and extended growing seasons. The transformation of the strawberry from a tiny wild fruit to a commercial crop available year-round in supermarkets represents one of the most dramatic changes in fruit breeding. A medieval person would likely not recognize modern strawberries as the same type of fruit they occasionally foraged from the forest floor. The peach offers another fascinating example of how selective breeding has transformed our food. Peaches originated in China, where they've been cultivated for thousands of years. By the medieval period, they had reached Europe, but they were nothing like the large, juicy fruits we enjoy today. Medieval peaches were smaller, with less flesh and larger pits. The flesh clung tightly to the pit. Modern varieties, where the flesh separates easily from the pit, freestone peaches, are a more recent development. They were also fuzzier, with thicker, more pronounced fuzz than modern varieties. In terms of flavor, medieval peaches were often more acidic and less sweet than their modern counterparts. They were typically cooked rather than eaten fresh, both to improve their flavor and because without modern refrigeration and transportation, peaches were often partly spoiled by the time they reached consumers. Modern peach varieties have been bred for increased size, higher sugar content, and reduced fuzz. They've also been selected for appearance, uniform shape, and attractive coloring, and for shipping qualities like firmness and resistance to bruising. The dramatic difference between medieval and modern peaches reflects a broader trend in fruit breeding, selection for commercial qualities, often at the expense of other characteristics like flavor complexity or nutrient content. A particularly striking example of produce transformation is the cucumber. While cucumbers have been cultivated for thousands of years, medieval and ancient cucumbers would barely be recognizable to modern consumers. Wild cucumbers, the ancestors of our modern varieties, are small and extremely bitter. They were primarily valued for their medicinal properties rather than as food. Even early cultivated cucumbers retained significant bitterness and were often prepared with techniques designed to reduce this unpleasant quality, such as salting, soaking in vinegar, or cooking. Medieval cucumbers came in various shapes, some round like apples, others curved like crescents. They had thick, bumpy skins and large seeds. They were typically yellow when ripe, rather than the green we associate with modern cucumbers. The flesh was less crisp and more watery than modern varieties. Today's cucumbers have been bred to eliminate bitterness almost entirely. They have thinner, smoother skins, smaller seeds, and more uniform shape. Varieties like the English cucumber have been bred to be essentially seedless with extremely thin, edible skin. These changes have transformed the cucumber from a medicinal plant with questionable palatability to a refreshing mild vegetable enjoyed raw in salads and sandwiches. The development of bitter-free cucumbers is so recent that older cookbooks often include instructions for salting and draining cucumbers to remove bitterness, a step that's unnecessary with most modern varieties. Another vegetable that medieval people would find unfamiliar is the modern carrot. We've already discussed how carrots weren't originally orange, but the transformation goes beyond color. Wild carrots, Queen Anne's lace, produce thin, woody, white roots with a strong bitter taste. Early domesticated carrots, including those available in medieval times, were purple, white, or yellow. They were thinner and more fibrous than modern varieties, with a stronger, less sweet flavor. Medieval carrots weren't primarily grown for their roots, but for their aromatic seeds, which were used as flavoring. The roots were secondary in importance and were typically cooked rather than eaten raw. They were often used in medicinal preparations rather than as a regular food. Modern carrots have been bred for increased size, sweetness, and reduced fiber content. They've been selected for uniform shape and smooth skin, making them easier to peel and more visually appealing. The familiar bright orange color was developed relatively recently, becoming common only after the 16th century. The transformation of the carrot from a tough, bitter medicinal plant to a sweet, crunchy vegetable enjoyed by children and adults alike is a testament to the power of selective breeding to change not just the appearance, but the fundamental culinary characteristics of a plant. Let's now consider a fruit that's become a symbol of tropical abundance, but would have been completely unknown to medieval Europeans: the pineapple. While not available in medieval Europe, the pineapple's transformation offers another striking example of how domestication changes plants. Wild pineapples, which still grow in parts of South America, are small, extremely fibrous, and intensely acidic. They contain large, hard seeds that make eating them challenging. The flesh is minimal compared to the tough core. Indigenous peoples of the Americas domesticated pineapples long before European contact, selecting for larger size, reduced seediness, and sweeter flavor. By the time Columbus encountered pineapples in the Caribbean in 1493, they had already been significantly improved through centuries of selection. Still, these early domesticated pineapples were different from modern varieties. They were smaller, with more prominent eyes, the hard, scaly sections on the fruit's surface, and they contained more fiber and acidity than today's pineapples. When pineapples were first introduced to Europe, they were so rare and exotic that they became symbols of extreme wealth and hospitality. They were more often displayed as table decorations than actually eaten. Renting a pineapple for display at a social event was a practice among the aspiring middle class who couldn't afford to purchase the fruit outright. Modern pineapple varieties have been bred for increased sweetness, reduced acidity, larger size, and more uniform shape. They've also been selected for characteristics important to commercial production, such as higher yield and better shipping qualities. The pineapple's journey from a small, seedy, acidic fruit to a symbol of tropical abundance illustrates how human selection can dramatically transform plants in ways that go beyond physical characteristics, changing their cultural significance as well. Now let's return to a fruit that was available in medieval Europe, but in a form quite different from what we know today. While grapes have been cultivated for thousands of years, primarily for wine production, table grapes have undergone significant changes. Medieval grapes were smaller, seedier, and had thicker skins than modern table varieties. They often had a higher acid-to-sugar ratio, making them tangier and less sweet. Many varieties had strong, distinctive flavors that could be quite intense compared to the mild sweetness of modern table grapes. Wine grapes and table grapes were not as distinctly separated as they are today. The same varieties might be used for both purposes, whereas modern breeding has created specialized varieties, optimized either for wine production or for fresh eating. Modern table grapes have been bred for increased size, seedlessness, crisp texture, and mild sweet flavor. The development of seedless grapes, now the standard in supermarkets, is a relatively recent innovation. While naturally occurring seedless mutations have been known for centuries, their widespread cultivation and commercialization is largely a product of 20th century breeding programs. The transformation of grapes illustrates a common pattern in fruit breeding: selection for convenience, seedlessness, uniform ripening, extended shelf life, and mild flavor, rather than the complex, intense flavors that often characterized older varieties. Let's consider another staple that would have been unrecognizable to medieval Europeans: corn or maize. As we discussed earlier, the ancestor of modern corn is teosinte, a grass with tiny, hard-shelled kernels. Even the earliest domesticated corn was dramatically different from modern varieties. Early corn had much smaller ears with fewer kernels. These kernels were harder and less sweet than modern sweet corn. Most varieties were used for flour or hominy rather than being eaten fresh off the cob. The sugars in the kernels converted to starch very quickly after harvesting, meaning that even varieties intended for fresh eating would become starchy and less sweet within hours of being picked. Modern sweet corn varieties have been bred for increased tenderness, higher sugar content, and delayed conversion of sugar to starch. Modern supersweet varieties can remain sweet for days after harvest, a characteristic that would have seemed miraculous to earlier cultivators. The transformation of corn from a small starchy grain to the sweet, tender vegetable we enjoy at summer barbecues represents one of the most dramatic changes in our food supply, all achieved through traditional breeding methods before the advent of modern genetic engineering. Let's now consider a fruit that has undergone perhaps the most dramatic visual transformation: the banana. We've already discussed how wild bananas are filled with large, hard seeds that make them barely edible, but the story of the banana's domestication is even more fascinating. The modern yellow banana that dominates supermarket shelves worldwide is a relatively recent development. It's a variety called Cavendish, and it only became the global standard in the mid-20th century. Before that, a different variety called Gros Michel was the primary export banana. Gros Michel was reportedly sweeter and more flavorful than the Cavendish, but it was virtually wiped out by a fungal disease called Panama disease. Both Cavendish and Gros Michel bananas are seedless, propagated through cuttings rather than seeds. This means they're genetically identical clones, a situation that makes them vulnerable to diseases, but ideal for commercial production due to their uniformity. The transformation of the banana from a seedy, starchy wild fruit to a sweet, seedless snack represents one of the most dramatic examples of how human selection has changed our food. If you could place a wild banana next to a modern Cavendish, you might struggle to believe they're related at all. What's particularly interesting about bananas is that, unlike many fruits which have undergone recent transformations through modern breeding programs, seedless bananas were developed thousands of years ago through careful observation and selection by farmers in Southeast Asia. The first seedless bananas were likely discovered as natural mutations and then propagated through cuttings. This early development of seedless bananas means that Alexander the Great might have encountered them when his armies reached India, making them perhaps one of the earliest examples of human-modified fruits. However, these ancient seedless bananas would still have been quite different from our modern varieties: smaller, starchier, and less sweet. The banana's journey from a seedy wild plant to one of the world's most popular fruits reveals how dramatically human intervention can reshape nature, and how this process has been ongoing for thousands of years, long before we understood the genetics behind it. Let's shift our attention now to another plant that produces multiple important foods: the olive. Olives have been cultivated for thousands of years in the Mediterranean region, and by medieval times they were already a staple food and source of oil. However, medieval olives would still have differed from modern varieties in several important ways. Wild olives are small, bitter fruits with minimal flesh and large pits. They're essentially inedible without processing. Early domesticated olives, including those available in medieval times, were larger than wild olives but still smaller than many modern varieties. They had a higher pit-to-flesh ratio and produced less oil. Medieval olive oil would have been extracted using primitive pressing methods that left more of the valuable oil behind in the pomace, the solid remains after pressing. The oil was likely cloudier, with stronger, more variable flavors than the standardized products we're accustomed to today. Modern olive varieties have been selected for specific characteristics, some for oil production, higher oil content, particular flavor profiles, others for table olives, larger size, particular textures, ease of processing. This specialization of varieties for different purposes is a relatively recent development. The olive's transformation from a small bitter wild fruit to a valuable agricultural product began thousands of years ago, but the refinement of olive varieties continues today, with ongoing selection for disease resistance, yield, and specific flavor profiles. Another plant that would have been unfamiliar to medieval Europeans but illustrates the dramatic changes in our food supply is the avocado. Wild avocados are smaller than cultivated varieties, with thinner flesh and proportionally larger seeds. Their flesh is less buttery and more fibrous, and the flavor is often more pronounced, sometimes with bitter or resinous notes. When avocados were first domesticated in Mesoamerica thousands of years ago, growers selected for larger size, increased flesh, and improved flavor. By the time Europeans encountered avocados in the 16th century, they had already been significantly improved through centuries of selection. However, the transformation of the avocado continued as commercial production expanded. Modern commercial varieties like Hass, which accounts for about 80% of avocados sold globally, have been selected for characteristics important to the market: consistent ripening, good shipping qualities, high yield, and consumer-friendly attributes like rich flavor and creamy texture. The avocado's journey from a wild fruit to a global commodity showcases how breeding objectives change over time. Ancient domesticators selected primarily for increased food value, while modern breeding has focused on commercial considerations like uniformity, shelf life, and marketability. Let's now consider a vegetable that medieval people would have recognized but in a form quite different from what we know today: the onion. Onions have been cultivated for thousands of years and were common in medieval kitchens, but they've undergone significant changes through selective breeding. Wild onions are small, with a strong, often harsh flavor and abundant pungency that can bring tears to your eyes. They have thin layers and don't store as well as modern varieties. Early domesticated onions, including those available in medieval times, were already larger than their wild ancestors but still smaller and more pungent than many modern varieties. Medieval onions came in a range of colors: red, white, yellow, and brown, and were valued for their ability to add flavor to otherwise bland meals. They were also prized for their storage qualities, providing a source of flavor during winter months, when fresh vegetables were scarce. Modern onions have been bred for increased size, disease resistance, and storage quality. Some varieties have been selected for reduced pungency, creating the sweet onions that are popular for raw consumption. Others have been bred for higher levels of specific flavor compounds for particular culinary uses. The development of mild sweet onions like Vidalia and Walla Walla is particularly noteworthy, and these varieties turn what was traditionally a supporting ingredient into something that can be enjoyed as a featured vegetable in its own right. The transformation of the onion from a small, intensely pungent plant to a diverse vegetable, with varieties optimized for different uses, demonstrates how selective breeding can modify even the most familiar foods in ways that change their culinary role. Throughout this journey exploring medieval produce and its transformation into modern fruits and vegetables, we've seen a consistent pattern. The wild ancestors of our familiar foods were typically smaller, less sweet, more fibrous, seedier, and often more bitter or astringent than their modern descendants. These characteristics weren't accidents, they were defense mechanisms that helped plants survive in the wild. Bitterness deters animals from eating the plant. Seeds ensure reproductive success. Tough skins and fibers make the plant more resistant to damage and decay. Small size allows energy to be directed towards seed production rather than edible flesh. Through thousands of years of selection, humans have systematically dismantled these natural defenses, transforming plants to prioritize characteristics beneficial to us rather than to the plants themselves. We've selected for larger edible portions, reduced seeds, softer textures, sweeter flavors, and reduced bitterness. This process has given us foods that would seem miraculous to our medieval ancestors: huge, sweet, seedless fruits, tender, mild vegetables, grains with dramatically increased yield. Modern produce is more calorie-dense, more palatable, and often easier to harvest and process than its medieval counterparts. However, this transformation has come with some trade-offs. Many modern fruits and vegetables are lower in certain nutrients and beneficial phytochemicals than their ancestors. The bitter compounds we've bred out of many plants often have health benefits. The focus on size and yield has sometimes come at the expense of flavor complexity and nutritional density. Additionally, the standardization of produce for commercial agriculture has led to a dramatic reduction in diversity. Of the thousands of apple varieties that existed a century ago, only a handful dominate commercial production today. The same is true for most crops. We've narrowed our food supply to focus on a small number of varieties optimized for commercial production rather than nutrition or flavor diversity. Understanding the history of our food reveals something profound about humanity's relationship with nature. We haven't simply discovered foods in the wild and begun cultivating them. We've fundamentally reshaped them according to our preferences and needs. The fruits and vegetables we take for granted are not natural products but human creations, the result of thousands of years of careful observation, selection, and propagation. This process represents one of humanity's greatest achievements: the transformation of sparse, barely edible wild plants into the abundant, nutritious, and delicious foods that sustain billions of people today. It's an achievement we rarely pause to appreciate as we bite into a crisp apple or slice a juicy tomato. The story of this transformation is not complete, however. Modern breeding techniques, including genetic engineering, are accelerating the pace of change. Today's plant breeders can achieve in decades what once took centuries. They're developing varieties with enhanced nutrition, improved disease resistance, and adaptation to changing climates. As we face challenges like population growth, climate change, and environmental degradation, the ability to continue adapting our food crops may prove crucial to human survival. The same ingenuity that transformed bitter wild plants into delicious modern produce may help us develop sustainable food systems for the future. So the next time you visit a grocery store or farmer's market, take a moment to really look at the fruits and vegetables on display. Remember that behind each familiar food lies thousands of years of human innovation, a long journey from wild plant to modern crop. What seems ordinary is actually extraordinary, a testament to humanity's enduring partnership with the plant world. Let's delve deeper into the tomato, a fruit that has undergone remarkable transformation in just a few centuries. When tomatoes first arrived in Europe from the Americas in the 16th century, they were very different from the varieties we know today. Early European tomatoes were typically small and yellow or orange rather than red, which is why they were called golden apples in Italian, pomodoro, which became pomodoro. These early tomatoes had thicker skins, more seeds, and a more intense acidic flavor than modern varieties. They were irregularly shaped, often deeply ribbed or segmented rather than smooth and round, and as we mentioned earlier, they were viewed with suspicion due to their relationship to known poisonous plants in the nightshade family. Modern breeding has given us tomatoes in a stunning range of sizes, shapes, colors, and flavors. We have tiny cherry tomatoes and massive beefsteaks. We have perfectly round slicing tomatoes and oval romas. They come in red, yellow, orange, green, purple, striped, and nearly black varieties. Some are bred for sweetness, others for acidity, still others for their ability to maintain texture when cooked. Perhaps most remarkably, Modern tomatoes have been bred for extended shelf life and shipping durability, often at the expense of flavor. Commercial tomatoes are typically harvested while still green and firm, then artificially ripened with ethylene gas before reaching supermarkets. This process allows for mass distribution, but results in the bland, mealy tomatoes that have become common in grocery stores. The difference between a mass-produced commercial tomato and a ripe heirloom variety grown in good soil is so dramatic that they almost seem like different fruits entirely. The modern industrial tomato represents a different set of breeding priorities: uniformity, durability, and yield rather than flavor or nutrition. This highlights an important aspect of plant domestication that's often overlooked. Breeding priorities change based on who's doing the selecting and for what purpose. When farmers selected seeds for their own use, flavor and nutrition were major considerations. When breeding shifted to commercial enterprises focused on mass distribution, priorities changed accordingly. The transformation of the tomato from a suspicious ornamental to an industrial crop, to the diverse spectrum of varieties available today, tells us something important about our evolving relationship with food and reminds us that domestication is an ongoing process, not a completed event. Let's now turn our attention to lettuce, a vegetable that has undergone significant changes since medieval times. Wild lettuce Lactuca cereola is a tall, spindly plant with small, scattered leaves. It contains high levels of a milky latex that makes it intensely bitter. In fact, its Latin name Lactuca refers to this milky substance. Early domesticated lettuce, including varieties available in medieval Europe, was already improved from this wild form but still quite different from modern varieties. Medieval lettuce was typically loose-leafed rather than forming tight heads. The leaves were darker, tougher, and more bitter than modern varieties, with a stronger flavor that would likely be off-putting to modern palates accustomed to mild, sweet lettuce. Lettuce in medieval times was often cooked rather than eaten raw. The cooking process helped reduce the bitterness and made the tough leaves more palatable. It was also frequently served with strong dressings or sauces that would mask its bitter flavor. Modern lettuce varieties have been bred for reduced bitterness, increased sweetness, and diverse textures and appearances. We now have crisp iceberg lettuce that forms tight heads, tender butterhead varieties, elongated romaine, and loose leaf lettuces in various colors and shapes. All these diverse forms descend from the same bitter wild plant. The transformation of lettuce represents a particularly clear example of how domestication often works to reduce plants' natural defense mechanisms. Bitterness in wild lettuce serves to deter herbivores. It's a chemical defense that protects the plant. By selecting for reduced bitterness, humans have effectively disarmed this defense mechanism, creating plants that would be more vulnerable in the wild but more palatable to us. The story of lettuce's transformation from a bitter latex-filled plant to a mild, crisp vegetable illuminates how human preferences shape the evolution of our food plants, sometimes in directions that run counter to their natural adaptations. Now let's consider the pea, a vegetable that was common in medieval Europe but in a form quite different from what we enjoy today. Wild peas have small, tough pods and tiny seeds. They contain compounds that make them difficult to digest when raw. Early domesticated peas, including those available in medieval times, were primarily grown for their dried seeds rather than being eaten fresh. Medieval peas were harvested when mature and fully dried on the vine. They were then stored and used throughout the year in soups, stews, and porridges. Fresh green peas, which we consider a spring delicacy, were not commonly eaten in medieval Europe. The varieties grown then had tougher pods and less sweet seeds than modern garden peas. The development of tender, sweet peas for fresh eating is a relatively recent innovation. The breeding of varieties with high sugar content and tender texture has transformed peas from a staple dried food to a fresh vegetable prized for its brief seasonal availability. Modern breeding has given us several distinct types of peas: sweet garden peas with inedible pods grown for their tender seeds, Snow peas with flat edible pods harvested before the seeds develop, and snap peas with edible pods and developed seeds combining the best features of both types. The transformation of the pea from a tough, starchy survival food to a sweet, tender vegetable highlights how breeding can fundamentally change not just the characteristics of a plant, but how we use it in our diets. Let's also consider the beet, a vegetable that has undergone significant transformation through domestication. Wild beets produce small, tough, woody roots with a strong, earthy flavor that can be quite bitter. They were primarily valued for their leaves rather than their roots. Early domesticated beets, including those available in medieval Europe, had already been selected for larger, more tender roots, but they were still smaller and more fibrous than modern varieties. Medieval beets came in various colors, red, white, yellow, and were valued for both their roots and their leaves. Modern table beets have been bred for increased sweetness, tenderness, and uniform shape. The intense sweetness of modern beets, which allows them to be used in desserts and sweet dishes, is largely the result of selective breeding for higher sugar content. Interestingly, the same species Beta vulgaris has been bred in different directions to create distinct vegetables: table beets grown for their sweet roots, Swiss chard grown for its leaves and stems, and sugar beets cultivated specifically for sugar production. This diversification from a single species demonstrates how dramatically selective breeding can reshape plants for different uses. The transformation of the beet from a tough, bitter root to a sweet, tender vegetable exemplifies how domestication often enhances characteristics that are merely hints in wild plants, amplifying them through generations of selection until they become defining features. Now let's explore a fruit that was available in medieval Europe but has undergone significant changes: the pear. Wild pears produce small, hard fruits that are intensely astringent due to high levels of tannins. They're barely edible raw, and were historically used primarily for making pear cider rather than fresh eating. Medieval pears were larger than wild pears but still smaller and grittier than modern varieties. They contained stone cells, the gritty bits in pear flesh, in much higher concentrations. Many varieties were too hard and astringent to eat raw, and were instead cooked with honey or spices or used for making perry. Modern pears have been bred for increased size, juiciness, and reduced grittiness. Different varieties have been developed for different uses, some ideal for fresh eating, others for cooking or canning. The development of butter pears with smooth melting flesh free from grittiness is a relatively recent achievement in pear breeding. The transformation of the pear from a hard, astringent fruit, suitable mainly for fermentation, to a sweet, juicy dessert fruit illustrates how selective breeding can fundamentally change the culinary role of a food, moving it from one category, cooking or processing ingredient, to another, fresh eating. Let's now consider a nut that was common in medieval Europe but has changed significantly: the almond. Wild almonds contain high levels of amygdalin, a compound that breaks down into hydrogen cyanide when the seed is damaged. This makes wild almonds potentially lethal if consumed in quantity, a powerful defense mechanism that protects the seeds from being eaten. The domestication of almonds, which began thousands of years ago in the Middle East, focused on selecting for a natural mutation that blocks the production of amygdalin, resulting in sweet rather than bitter almonds. By medieval times, sweet almonds were well established in Europe, but they were still smaller and had harder shells than many modern varieties. Medieval almonds were a luxury ingredient, often used in ground form as a thickener for sauces or as a base for almond milk, which was popular during fasting periods when animal products were forbidden. The nuts were difficult to process due to their hard shells and required significant labor to prepare. Modern almond varieties have been selected for larger size, thinner shells, and specific flavor profiles. Commercial production focuses on varieties that produce uniform, attractive nuts with reliable yield. The development of mechanical harvesting and processing has transformed almonds from a labor-intensive luxury to a widely available snack and cooking ingredient. The almond's transformation from a toxic wild seed to a safe, nutritious food illustrates how selective breeding can overcome even the most formidable natural defenses, turning a potentially dangerous plant into a valuable crop. Now, let's explore a spice that was highly valued in medieval Europe, but quite different from its modern form. Black pepper was one of the most precious commodities in medieval trade, worth its weight in gold in some contexts. It was so valuable that it was used as currency, included in dowries, and sometimes used to pay taxes or ransoms. Medieval pepper was often of variable quality due to the long, complex trade routes it traveled from its source in India to European markets. It might be adulterated with other substances or degraded during the months-long journey. The berries themselves were similar to modern pepper, but the processing and preservation methods were less consistent, leading to greater variation in flavor and pungency. Today, standardized processing and modern transportation have made high-quality pepper universally available and relatively affordable. Different varieties and processing methods, black, white, green, and red pepper, all come from the same plant but are processed differently, provide a range of flavor profiles for different culinary uses. While pepper hasn't undergone the same dramatic physical transformation as fruits and vegetables, its journey from rare luxury to common kitchen staple reflects another aspect of how our food supply has changed since medieval times, not just through breeding, but through improvements in processing, preservation, and distribution. Let's now turn our attention to a group of vegetables that have undergone particularly dramatic transformations, the brassicas. We've already discussed how cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, kale, and kohlrabi are all the same species, Brassica oleracea, bred to emphasize different plant parts. Let's explore this fascinating family in more detail. Wild cabbage is a leafy plant native to the coastal areas of Europe. It has tough, waxy leaves and a strong, bitter flavor, adaptations that help it survive in harsh, salty environments. From this unpromising starting point, ancient farmers began selecting plants with unusual growth patterns, gradually developing the diverse vegetables we know today. Kale, one of the forms closest to wild cabbage, was common in medieval Europe. It was valued for its hardiness, able to withstand frost and provide green vegetables during winter months when little else was available. Medieval kale would have been tougher and more bitter than modern varieties, requiring long cooking to become palatable. Head cabbage, with its dense wrapped leaves, was also known in medieval Europe, though the tight uniform heads we're familiar with today are the result of more recent breeding. Medieval cabbages likely had looser heads and stronger flavor. They were a dietary staple, often fermented into sauerkraut as a means of preservation. Cauliflower represents a particularly dramatic transformation of the cabbage plant. It's the result of a mutation that causes the plant to produce a dense cluster of immature flower buds rather than normal flowers. This mutation was recognized and propagated by farmers in the Mediterranean region, with cauliflower becoming established in European cuisine by the 16th century. Medieval Europeans would have found modern cauliflower strange and remarkable. Broccoli, like cauliflower, is a form of cabbage bred for its immature flower clusters, but with a different growth pattern. It became common in Italy during the Renaissance, but wasn't widely known in Northern Europe until much later. A medieval European transported to a modern supermarket would probably not recognize broccoli as a food plant at all. Brussels sprouts represent perhaps the most unusual transformation of the cabbage plant. They're the result of selecting for plants that produce numerous small cabbage-like heads along the main stem rather than a single large head. They were developed in Belgium, hence the name, and became common in European cuisine only in the 19th century. They would have been completely unknown in medieval Europe. The diverse brassica vegetables demonstrate the remarkable plasticity of plants under human selection. By identifying and propagating natural mutations and unusual growth patterns, farmers have transformed a single species into multiple distinct vegetables with different appearances, flavors, and culinary uses. This diversity is a testament to human creativity and observational skills, developed long before we understood the genetics behind these transformations. Let's now consider a group of fruits that have undergone significant changes through domestication: stone fruits like peaches, plums, cherries, and apricots. All these fruits belong to the prunus genus and share similar wild ancestors: small fruits with thin flesh and large pits, often bitter or astringent in flavor. Wild stone fruits have minimal flesh surrounding their pits. The fruits are small, and the flesh is often fibrous and strongly flavored. They typically contain compounds that create bitterness or astringency, natural defenses against being eaten before their seeds are fully developed. By medieval times, stone fruits had already been improved through centuries of selection, but they were still quite different from modern varieties. Medieval peaches, for example, were smaller and fuzzier than modern peaches, with flesh that clung tightly to the pit. They were often cooked or preserved rather than eaten fresh. Medieval plums came in many varieties but were generally smaller and more acidic than modern dessert plums. They were commonly dried to make prunes, which served as an important preserved food and medicinal ingredient. Cherries in medieval Europe were largely sour varieties used for cooking rather than the sweet cherries that dominate modern markets. They were smaller than modern cherries and had larger pits relative to their size. Apricots, introduced to Europe through Arab trade routes, were valued for their early ripening but had less flesh and stronger flavor than modern varieties. Modern stone fruits have been bred for increased flesh-to-pit ratio, sweeter flavor, reduced bitterness, and diverse ripening times. The development of freestone varieties where the flesh separates easily from the pit has made these fruits more convenient for fresh eating. The transformation of stone fruits from small bitter wild plants to sweet juicy modern varieties illustrates how selective breeding amplifies desirable characteristics that may be minimal in wild plants, gradually enhancing them until they become defining features of the domesticated crop. Let's explore another important food crop: rice. Rice has been cultivated for thousands of years and was known in medieval Europe primarily as an imported luxury. The transformation of rice from its wild ancestors to modern varieties represents one of the most important developments in global agriculture. Wild rice species in the genus Oryza produce few grains per plant, and those grains shatter easily, falling to the ground as soon as they mature. This is an excellent adaptation for seed dispersal in the wild, but makes harvesting difficult. Wild rice also has long awns, bristle-like appendages, and hulls that are difficult to remove. Early domesticated rice, including varieties known in medieval times, had been improved with reduced shattering, making harvesting more efficient. However, yields were much lower than modern varieties, and processing the grain required significant labor. Modern rice varieties have been bred for dramatically increased yield, specific cooking qualities, sticky rice, long grain rice, etc., and adaptation to different growing conditions. The development of semi-dwarf rice varieties during the Green Revolution of the 1960s led to plants that direct more energy to grain production and less to stem growth, substantially increasing yield. The transformation of rice from a wild grass to the staple food for more than half the world's population represents one of the most important achievements in agricultural history. It's a crop that has been continuously improved for thousands of years, with breeding efforts that continue today as researchers develop varieties with enhanced nutrition, pest resistance, and adaptation to changing climates. Now let's consider one more fruit that illustrates the dramatic changes in our food supply: the strawberry. While we touched on strawberries earlier, their story deserves more attention because it represents a different kind of transformation, not just selection within a species, but the creation of an entirely new hybrid. The small woodland strawberries, Fragaria vesca, that grew wild in medieval Europe, were intensely flavorful but tiny, about the size of a small marble. Gathering enough for a substantial serving was time-consuming, and the berries bruised easily, making them difficult to transport or store. The modern garden strawberry, Fragaria gardnergianassa, didn't exist until the 18th century. It's a hybrid that resulted from a chance crossing between two American species, the Virginia strawberry Fragaria virginiana from North America and the Chilean strawberry Fragaria chiloensis from South America. Both these species had been brought to Europe following the exploration of the Americas. This hybridization created a larger, more robust fruit that could be commercially cultivated. Even these early hybrid strawberries were much smaller than today's varieties, which have been bred for enormous size, sweetness, and visual appeal. Modern strawberries can be 20 times larger than their wild ancestors, with extended growing seasons and improved shipping qualities. The transformation of the strawberry from a tiny wild fruit to a commercial crop represents a different aspect of plant domestication. The creation of entirely new forms through hybridization between species. This process, which happens occasionally in nature but has been deliberately exploited by plant breeders, has given us many improved crops and continues to be an important tool in modern plant breeding. As we draw our journey through the history of produce to a close, let's reflect on what we've learned about the transformation of our food from medieval times to the present day. The fruits and vegetables we take for granted are not gifts from nature, but the results of thousands of years of human innovation. What began as small, bitter, seedy wild plants have been transformed through careful selection into the sweet, tender, abundant foods that fill our markets today. This transformation represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. A quiet revolution that has unfolded across generations, dramatically increasing our food supply and making previously sparse or unpalatable plants into dietary staples. The process continues today, with modern breeding techniques accelerating the pace of change. As we face challenges like climate change, population growth, and environmental degradation, our ability to adapt our food plants may prove crucial to human survival. The next time you bite into a crisp apple, slice a juicy tomato, or peel a seedless banana, take a moment to appreciate the millennia of human ingenuity that transformed these foods from their wild ancestors into the nourishing, delicious produce we enjoy today. Our medieval ancestors would be amazed by the abundance and quality of modern produce. The fruits and vegetables that we take for granted would seem like magical creations to them, larger, sweeter, more varied, and more palatable than anything they knew. In this quiet transformation of our food supply lies a powerful testament to human creativity, observation, and persistence. Generation after generation, farmers and gardeners have selected and propagated plants with desirable characteristics, gradually reshaping nature according to human preferences. This long-term partnership between humans and plants has changed not just what we eat but how we live. Without the dramatic improvements in our food crops, modern civilization as we know it would be impossible. The abundance created through plant breeding has made possible population growth, urbanization, and the development of complex societies. As we look to the future, understanding the history of our food becomes increasingly important. The genetic diversity of our crops, including the traits preserved in older varieties and wild relatives, represents a crucial resource for continued adaptation and improvement. By appreciating how dramatically our food has changed, we gain a new perspective on our relationship with nature, not as passive consumers of what the earth provides, but as active participants in an ongoing process of coevolution with the plants that sustain us. From the medieval table to the modern supermarket, the story of our food is a story of human ingenuity, patience, and vision, a reminder that even the most ordinary aspects of daily life can reveal extraordinary achievements when we understand their history. So, the next time you enjoy a piece of fruit or a serving of vegetables, remember you're tasting thousands of years of human history, innovation, and care. A legacy passed down through countless generations and transformed, one careful selection at a time, from barely edible wild plants to the nourishing, delicious foods that sustain us today. As you drift off to sleep tonight, I hope you'll carry with you a new appreciation for the ordinary miracles on your plate and the extraordinary human story behind them. Let's now explore the history of spices that would have been used in medieval cooking, with another area where modern diners would find significant differences. Spices in medieval Europe were extraordinarily valuable, often worth their weight in gold. They weren't just flavoring agents but status symbols, medicines, and preservation tools. Pepper, which we now take for granted as a common table condiment, was one of the most valuable commodities in medieval trade. It traveled thousands of miles from India along complex trade routes, passing through numerous middlemen who each increased its price. By the time it reached European kitchens, black pepper was so precious that it was counted out by the individual peppercorn, and kept under lock and key. Medieval pepper was likely stronger and more variable in flavor than the standardized product we use today. Its journey from India to Europe could take months or even years, during which time its quality might degrade. Additionally, it was often adulterated with cheaper substances to stretch its value, an early form of food fraud. Cinnamon, another spice we use casually today, was similarly precious in medieval Europe. The true source of cinnamon was kept secret by Arab traders who brought it to Europe, leading to fantastic origin stories including tales of giant birds that used cinnamon sticks to build their nests on inaccessible cliffs. The cinnamon had to be obtained, according to these tales, by leaving heavy pieces of meat near the nests, which the birds would carry back, causing the nests to collapse under the weight. The reality, of course, was that cinnamon came from the bark of trees grown in Sri Lanka and southern India. Medieval cinnamon was likely stronger and more variable in quality than modern standardized products. It was used not just in cooking but as medicine and as an ingredient in religious ceremonies. Nutmeg and mace, both derived from the fruit of the same tree, were similarly valuable and exotic. A single nutmeg seed could be sold for enough money to feed a worker's family for a month. The Dutch went to extraordinary lengths to monopolize the nutmeg trade, even trading the island of Manhattan to the British in exchange for control of a tiny Indonesian island where nutmeg grew. These valuable spices weren't used in medieval cooking the way we might use them today. Instead, they were often used in large quantities in dishes prepared for the wealthy, both to showcase the host's riches and to mask the flavors of food that might be less than fresh in an era before refrigeration. This conspicuous consumption of spices resulted in flavor combinations that would seem bizarre to modern palates: meat pies heavily seasoned with cinnamon, cloves, and sugar, fish dishes sprinkled with nutmeg, sauces combining ginger, pepper, and honey. The medieval approach to spicing wasn't about balance or enhancement, but about transformation and display. The common herbs used in medieval cooking were also different from those we're familiar with today. While we might reach for basil, oregano, or cilantro, medieval cooks were more likely to use herbs like hyssop, rue, tansy, and alicost, plants that have largely disappeared from modern kitchens. These forgotten herbs often had stronger, more medicinal flavors than the ones we favor today. Many served dual purposes as both flavoring and medicine, reflecting the medieval belief in food as a tool for balancing the body's humors, the four bodily fluids thought to determine health and temperament. The transformation of our spice and herb preferences from medieval times to the present represents a significant shift in culinary philosophy. We've moved from using spices as status symbols and preservatives to valuing them for their ability to enhance and complement natural flavors. We've abandoned many strong-flavored medicinal herbs in favor of varieties with more delicate aromatic qualities. This change in flavor preferences parallels the transformation of fruits and vegetables. In both cases, we've generally moved toward milder, sweeter, more palatable options and away from the intense, sometimes harsh flavors that characterized medieval food. Speaking of food preservation, let's consider how the challenge of keeping food edible through winter months shaped medieval agriculture and diet. Without refrigeration, freezing, or modern canning methods, preserving the harvest was a critical concern. Many fruits and vegetables were selected not just for flavor or yield, but for their keeping qualities. Apple varieties that could be stored for months in cool cellars were particularly valued. These storage apples were typically harder, more acidic, and less sweet than modern dessert apples, characteristics that helped them resist spoilage. Cabbage, onions, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots were staples of the medieval winter diet precisely because they could be stored for extended periods without sophisticated preservation methods. These vegetables would be kept in cool, dark cellars, often buried in sand to help maintain humidity and prevent shriveling. Other preservation methods dramatically altered the flavor and texture of foods. Fruits might be dried in the sun or near ovens, concentrating their sugars and changing their character entirely. Vegetables could be fermented, as with sauerkraut, or preserved in vinegar or brine. Herbs were dried and stored for winter use, losing much of their aromatic quality in the process. These preservation necessities meant that the medieval experience of fruits and vegetables varied dramatically by season. Fresh produce was a spring and summer luxury during winter months. Most plant foods were either preserved or storage crops whose quality gradually declined as the season progressed. Modern agriculture, shipping, and preservation technologies have fundamentally changed this relationship with seasonality. Today we can enjoy fresh strawberries in December and crisp apples year-round, i.e., a constant abundance that would have seemed miraculous to medieval people. This disconnection from the seasonal rhythms of food production represents another profound change in our relationship with fruits and vegetables. We've gained convenience and variety, but perhaps lost something of the special appreciation that comes from eating foods only during their natural season of abundance. Let's now explore how cultural and religious factors influence the development of fruits and vegetables in medieval Europe. The spread of Christianity, with its calendar of feasts and fasts, created specific demands on food production and preservation. During Lent, the 40-day period of fasting before Easter, Christians were forbidden to eat meat, eggs, and dairy products. This created a strong demand for plant-based foods that could provide sustenance during this extended period. Nuts, dried fruits, and vegetables took on increased importance during these fasting periods. Almond milk, made by grinding almonds with water, became a critical substitute for dairy during fasting times. This created demand for almond varieties that produced smooth, flavorful milk, potentially influencing which trees were propagated and maintained. Monasteries played a crucial role in developing fruit varieties, particularly for wine production. Monks carefully selected and propagated grapevines that produced wine suitable for sacramental use and for sale. These monastic vineyards became centers of horticultural innovation, with careful record-keeping and long-term breeding projects that improved fruit quality over generations. Monastic gardens also preserved and improved many vegetable varieties, with their emphasis on self-sufficiency and their stable communities that could maintain growing traditions over centuries. Monasteries functioned as living seed banks, preserving diversity that might otherwise have been lost. Islamic influence in southern Europe, particularly in Spain during the Moorish period, introduced new fruits and vegetables and new cultivation techniques. Citrus fruits, eggplants, spinach, and artichokes all became more widely grown in Europe due to Islamic agricultural knowledge. Irrigation systems derived from Middle Eastern models transformed agriculture in parts of Spain and Italy, making it possible to grow water-intensive crops in previously unsuitable areas. The cultural exchange facilitated by trade routes, like the Silk Road, and later by European colonial expansion, brought new plants to the continent and new ideas about how to cultivate them. This cross-cultural pollination of agricultural knowledge has continued to shape our food plants, with techniques and varieties moving around the globe and adapting to new environments. Religion, culture, and trade have thus played crucial roles in shaping the fruits and vegetables we know today, influencing not just which plants were cultivated, but how they were grown, selected, and improved over generations. Let's now explore how the social stratification of medieval society influenced the development of different fruits and vegetables. The medieval diet was highly determined by social class, with significant differences between what peasants, merchants, and nobility ate. Peasants primarily ate what they could grow themselves or obtain locally. Their gardens emphasized calorie-dense, reliable crops that could be grown with minimal specialized knowledge. Cabbages, onions, leeks, and root vegetables, like turnips, formed the backbone of peasant vegetable consumption. Fruit consumption was often limited to what could be foraged from the wild or grown on a small scale near the home, such as crabapples, sloes, elderberries, and whatever cultivated fruit trees might be growing in the village. The foods of the peasantry needed to be hardy, high-yielding, and able to grow in less than ideal conditions. This created selection pressure for those characteristics rather than for refined flavor or appearance. The apple varieties grown in peasant orchards, for instance, might be selected primarily for their ability to make cider that would keep through the winter rather than for fresh eating quality. Merchants and townspeople, with more disposable income and access to markets, could enjoy a wider variety of fruits and vegetables, including those imported from other regions. Urban markets created demand for produce that could travel without spoiling quickly, potentially influencing which varieties were commercially grown. The nobility and wealthy clergy, with their extensive estates and gardeners, could grow highly specialized varieties selected for superior flavor and appearance, rather than just for yield or hardiness. Many great estates maintained fruit orchards with dozens or even hundreds of varieties, some selected specifically to ripen at different times to ensure a continuous supply throughout the growing season. This social stratification created, in effect, different tracks of plant breeding. Some varieties were developed for peasant subsistence, others for commercial markets, and still others for elite consumption. The characteristics valued in each context differed, leading to diversification within species. Some of this diversity was lost during the agricultural industrialization of the 19th and 20th centuries as commercial considerations began to dominate plant breeding. Varieties selected for their ability to ship well, their uniform appearance, or their compatibility with mechanical harvesting displaced many older types that excelled in flavor but lacked these commercial advantages. However, in recent decades, there has been renewed interest in heirloom varieties, older cultivars developed before modern commercial breeding. These plants often offer distinctive flavors, appearances, and growing characteristics that had been largely lost in commercial agriculture. This renewed appreciation for agricultural heritage has helped preserve some of the diversity that evolved through centuries of selective breeding in different social contexts. The history of our food plants thus reflects not just biological evolution but social history as well. The different needs and values of various social classes have left their mark on the fruits and vegetables we eat today. Let's now consider how the age of exploration and colonization transformed European diets by introducing entirely new fruits and vegetables from the Americas and other parts of the world. The Columbian Exchange (DIA), the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds following Columbus's voyages, represents one of the most significant transformations in global food history. Many foods we now consider staples of European cuisine were completely unknown in medieval Europe. Tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, maize corn, bell peppers, chili peppers, squashes, including pumpkins and zucchini, beans, including kidney, lima, and string beans, peanuts, sunflowers, and many other important food plants are native to the Americas and were introduced to Europe only after 1492. When these New World crops first arrived in Europe, they were often viewed with suspicion. The potato, which would later become a staple food across much of northern Europe, was initially grown as an ornamental curiosity. Its relationship to nightshade plants made many Europeans fear it was poisonous. It took decades or even centuries for some of these crops to be fully integrated into European diets. The transformation of these American crops through selective breeding continued after their introduction to Europe. European farmers selected varieties adapted to their growing conditions and culinary preferences, creating new forms distinct from those grown by indigenous Americans. The potato provides a particularly striking example of how a New World crop was transformed to meet European needs. The potatoes grown by Andean peoples came in diverse shapes, sizes, and colors, with different varieties adapted to various elevations and growing conditions. European farmers selected for large, high-yielding potatoes with shallow eyes, the dimples from which sprouts emerge, creating varieties optimized for European farming methods and cooking techniques. These New World crops dramatically altered European agriculture and nutrition. The potato in particular allowed population growth in regions where grain cultivation was difficult, such as the cold, wet highlands of Scotland and Ireland. However, this dependence on a narrow genetic base of potatoes also created vulnerability, as demonstrated by the devastating Irish potato famine of the 1840s, when potato blight destroyed the crop. The introduction of New World crops represents a different kind of transformation than the gradual improvement of Old World species through selective breeding. It was a sudden expansion of Europe's agricultural possibilities, bringing entirely new plant families with unique characteristics into cultivation. This global exchange of crops continues today, with modern plant breeders drawing on genetic resources from around the world to create improved varieties. The fruits and vegetables in your local market represent not just millennia of selective breeding, but centuries of global cultural exchange and adaptation. Let's delve deeper into the process of plant domestication itself, how humans transform wild plants into cultivated crops, and how this process has changed over time. Plant domestication begins with human selection of wild plants that show desirable variations. Perhaps one wild apple tree produces slightly larger or sweeter fruits, or one cabbage plant has unusually tender leaves. When these plants are propagated either by saving and planting their seeds, or by vegetative methods like grafting or taking cuttings, their desirable traits can be maintained and gradually enhanced. This traditional process of domestication happens in tiny increments across generations. Ancient and medieval farmers couldn't see the genes responsible for the traits they were selecting. They could only observe the plant's outward characteristics and choose accordingly. This process was slow but remarkably effective over long periods of time. The factors that influenced plant domestication in medieval and ancient times were complex. Humans selected not just for traits that made plants more edible or productive, but for characteristics that suited their agricultural systems, storage methods, cooking techniques, and cultural preferences. For example, cereal grains like wheat were selected for non-shattering seed heads, so the seeds wouldn't fall off the plant before harvest, and for hulls that could be easily removed. Fruits were often selected for their preservation qualities, how well they dried or kept in storage, as much as for their fresh eating quality. This process accelerated in the early modern period with the development of more systematic approaches to plant breeding. By the 18th and 19th centuries, plant breeders were deliberately crossing different varieties to combine their traits, a more directed approach than simply selecting the best plants from each generation. The scientific understanding of genetics, beginning with Gregor Mendel's experiments in the mid-19th century, laid the groundwork for even more sophisticated breeding techniques. By the early 20th century, breeders were using their understanding of genetic inheritance to guide crossing programs, creating new varieties more efficiently. The Green Revolution of the mid-20th century represented a dramatic acceleration in crop improvement. Norman Borlaug and other scientists developed high-yielding varieties of wheat, rice, and other staple crops that dramatically increased food production in many parts of the world. These modern varieties often combine traits like shorter stems, reducing the risk of lodging, where plants fall over before harvest, disease resistance, and higher grain-to-stem ratios. Today, plant breeding has entered a new phase with the development of genetic engineering techniques that allow direct manipulation of plant DNA. Unlike traditional breeding, which can only work with natural variations within a species or closely related species, genetic engineering can introduce genes from any organism, dramatically expanding the possibilities for crop improvement. These developments have accelerated the pace of plant transformation. Changes that once took centuries can now happen in decades or even years. This acceleration raises new questions about how we balance innovation with preservation of genetic diversity, traditional knowledge, and cultural relationships with food plants. The story of plant domestication is ongoing, a continuous conversation between human needs and plant biology that has transformed both our food and ourselves. The fruits and vegetables on our tables today represent the current state of this ancient dialogue, not its conclusion. Let's now explore how the Industrial Revolution and the development of modern agriculture transformed our fruits and vegetables in ways that go beyond selective breeding. The mechanization of agriculture, beginning in the 19th century and accelerating through the 20th, created new selection pressures for crop plants. Varieties needed to be compatible with machine harvesting miters ripening uniformly, having certain physical characteristics that made them easier to harvest mechanically, and being sturdy enough to withstand mechanical handling. For fruits like tomatoes, this meant breeding for tougher skins and firmer flesh that wouldn't be damaged by machine picking. These characteristics often came at the expense of flavor and texture, as anyone who has compared a homegrown tomato to a mass-produced one can attest. The development of long-distance food transportation systems similarly influenced crop breeding. Fruits and vegetables needed to withstand shipping over hundreds or thousands of miles, which meant selecting for varieties that ripened slowly after picking and had physical characteristics that resisted damage during transport. Modern refrigeration, controlled atmosphere storage, and other preservation technologies allowed additional modifications to produce. Apples, for instance, could be bred for characteristics that made them store well under these controlled conditions, rather than needing the natural keeping qualities that had been essential for storage apples in the past. The rise of supermarkets in the mid-20th century created new standards for visual uniformity and appearance. Produce needed to look perfect and consistent on store shelves, leading to selection for cosmetic characteristics that had little to do with flavor or nutrition. The perfect spherical shape of modern tomatoes, the uniform size of apples, the consistent deep orange of carrots. All these traits were enhanced to meet commercial standards rather than to improve eating quality. Monastic gardens also preserved and improved many vegetable varieties, with their emphasis on self-sufficiency and their stable communities that could maintain growing traditions over centuries. Monasteries functioned as living seed banks, preserving diversity that might otherwise have been lost. Islamic influence in southern Europe, particularly in Spain during the Moorish period, introduced new fruits and vegetables and new cultivation techniques. Citrus fruits, eggplants, spinach, and artichokes all became more widely grown in Europe due to Islamic agricultural knowledge. Irrigation systems derived from Middle Eastern models transformed agriculture in parts of Spain and Italy, making it possible to grow water-intensive crops in previously unsuitable areas. The cultural exchange facilitated by trade routes, like the Silk Road, and later by European colonial expansion, brought new plants to the continent and new ideas about how to cultivate them. This cross-cultural pollination of agricultural knowledge has continued to shape our food plants, with techniques and varieties moving around the globe and adapting to new environments. Religion, culture, and trade have thus played crucial roles in shaping the fruits and vegetables we know today, influencing not just which plants were cultivated, but how they were grown, selected, and improved over generations. Let's now explore how the social stratification of medieval society influenced the development of different fruits and vegetables. The medieval diet was highly determined by social class, with significant differences between what peasants, merchants, and nobility ate. Peasants primarily ate what they could grow themselves or obtain locally. Their gardens emphasized calorie-dense, reliable crops that could be grown with minimal specialized knowledge. Cabbages, onions, leeks, and root vegetables, like turnips, formed the backbone of peasant vegetable consumption. Fruit consumption was often limited to what could be foraged from the wild or grown on a small scale near the home, such as crabapples, sloes, elderberries, and whatever cultivated fruit trees might be growing in the village. The foods of the peasantry needed to be hardy, high-yielding, and able to grow in less than ideal conditions. This created selection pressure for those characteristics rather than for refined flavor or appearance. The apple varieties grown in peasant orchards, for instance, might be selected primarily for their ability to make cider that would keep through the winter rather than for fresh eating quality. Merchants and townspeople, with more disposable income and access to markets, could enjoy a wider variety of fruits and vegetables, including those imported from other regions. Urban markets created demand for produce that could travel without spoiling quickly, potentially influencing which varieties were commercially grown. The nobility and wealthy clergy, with their extensive estates and gardeners, could grow highly specialized varieties selected for superior flavor and appearance, rather than just for yield or hardiness. Many great estates maintained fruit orchards with dozens or even hundreds of varieties, some selected specifically to ripen at different times to ensure a continuous supply throughout the growing season. This social stratification created, in effect, different tracks of plant breeding. Some varieties were developed for peasant subsistence, others for commercial markets, and still others for elite consumption. The characteristics valued in each context differed, leading to diversification within species. Some of this diversity was lost during the agricultural industrialization of the 19th and 20th centuries as commercial considerations began to dominate plant breeding. Varieties selected for their ability to ship well, their uniform appearance, or their compatibility with mechanical harvesting displaced many older types that excelled in flavor but lacked these commercial advantages. However, in recent decades, there has been renewed interest in heirloom varieties, older cultivars developed before modern commercial breeding. These plants often offer distinctive flavors, appearances, and growing characteristics that had been largely lost in commercial agriculture. This renewed appreciation for agricultural heritage has helped preserve some of the diversity that evolved through centuries of selective breeding in different social contexts. The history of our food plants thus reflects not just biological evolution but social history as well. The different needs and values of various social classes have left their mark on the fruits and vegetables we eat today. Let's now consider how the age of exploration and colonization transformed European diets by introducing entirely new fruits and vegetables from the Americas and other parts of the world. The Columbian Exchange (DIA), the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old and New Worlds following Columbus's voyages, represents one of the most significant transformations in global food history. Many foods we now consider staples of European cuisine were completely unknown in medieval Europe. Tomatoes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, maize corn, bell peppers, chili peppers, squashes, including pumpkins and zucchini, beans, including kidney, lima, and string beans, peanuts, sunflowers, and many other important food plants are native to the Americas and were introduced to Europe only after 1492. When these New World crops first arrived in Europe, they were often viewed with suspicion. The potato, which would later become a staple food across much of northern Europe, was initially grown as an ornamental curiosity. Its relationship to nightshade plants made many Europeans fear it was poisonous. It took decades or even centuries for some of these crops to be fully integrated into European diets. The transformation of these American crops through selective breeding continued after their introduction to Europe. European farmers selected varieties adapted to their growing conditions and culinary preferences, creating new forms distinct from those grown by indigenous Americans. The potato provides a particularly striking example of how a New World crop was transformed to meet European needs. The potatoes grown by Andean peoples came in diverse shapes, sizes, and colors, with different varieties adapted to various elevations and growing conditions. European farmers selected for large, high-yielding potatoes with shallow eyes, the dimples from which sprouts emerge, creating varieties optimized for European farming methods and cooking techniques. These changes were further reinforced by the consolidation of seed companies and the development of industrial-scale farming. As fewer companies controlled more of the commercial seed market, they focused on varieties that worked well within industrial food systems, often at the expense of regional adaptation and flavor diversity. The result of these changes has been a dramatic narrowing of commercial crop diversity. While thousands of apple varieties were grown in 19th century America, just a handful dominate today's supermarkets. The same pattern holds true for most fruits and vegetables. We grow fewer varieties commercially, but in much larger quantities than at any time in the past. This industrialization of our food system has brought benefits in terms of food security, reduced seasonal scarcity, and lower prices. But it has also disconnected many people from the natural cycles of food production and led to a homogenization of our food experience. Fortunately, recent decades have seen a renewed interest in crop diversity, with farmers' markets, seed-saving organizations, and heritage breed conservators working to preserve and revitalize older varieties. This movement represents a recognition that something valuable was lost in the industrialization of our food system, and an effort to recapture some of the diversity, regional adaptation, and flavor complexity that characterized pre-industrial agriculture. The story of our fruits and vegetables is thus not simply one of improvement through breeding, but a complex narrative of changing priorities, technologies, and social systems that have transformed our relationship with food plants in profound ways. Let's now consider how modern scientific understanding is changing our perspective on the nutritional qualities of ancient, medieval, and modern produce. There's a common belief that modern fruits and vegetables are less nutritious than those our ancestors ate, that in breeding for sweetness, size, and visual appeal, we've sacrificed nutritional value. This idea contains some truth but requires nuance. Some studies have found declining levels of certain minerals in modern crop varieties compared to older ones. This may be partly due to breeding selecting for yield rather than nutrient density, and partly due to changes in growing methods and soil quality. The focus on sweetness in fruit breeding has certainly increased sugar content in many fruits, potentially reducing their nutritional value relative to their calorie content. Wild fruits in ancient varieties typically contained more fiber and secondary plant compounds relative to their sugar content. Many modern vegetables have been bred to be milder and less bitter, often by reducing levels of compounds like glucosinolates in brassicas like broccoli, or alkaloids in eggplants and tomatoes. While these changes make the vegetables more palatable, some of these bitter compounds have potential health benefits, meaning their reduction might represent a nutritional loss. However, the picture is complicated by several factors. First, the vastly increased availability of fruits and vegetables in the modern food system means most people consume more plant foods overall than their medieval ancestors, potentially offsetting any decline in nutrient density. Second, many wild plants and ancient crop varieties contained anti-nutritional compounds, substances that block the absorption of nutrients or are actively harmful in large quantities. Breeding has often reduced these compounds, potentially making the available nutrients more bioavailable. Third, modern growing, storage, and transportation methods can preserve nutrients that would have been lost in older food systems. A vegetable eaten months after harvest in medieval times would likely have lost more nutrients than a frozen modern vegetable, despite any differences in the initial nutrient content of the varieties. Interestingly, modern science is enabling new approaches to plant breeding that aim to optimize both palatability and nutrition. Biofortification programs, for instance, develop crop varieties with enhanced levels of specific nutrients to address nutritional deficiencies. Examples include high-iron beans, high-zinc wheat, and golden rice enhanced with vitamin A precursors. These efforts represent a new chapter in the story of plant domestication, one where scientific understanding of plant biochemistry and human nutrition guide breeding efforts alongside traditional concerns like yield, flavor, and appearance. The nutritional transformation of our food plants is thus an ongoing process, with modern science offering possibilities to enhance rather than diminish the health-promoting qualities of fruits and vegetables while maintaining the improvements in palatability, yield, and convenience that have been achieved through generations of breeding. As we continue to refine our understanding of plant chemistry and human nutrition, we may find ways to recapture some of the beneficial compounds that were inadvertently bred out of our food plants while preserving the characteristics that make modern varieties appealing and accessible to contemporary consumers. Let's explore how the globalization of agriculture has affected the diversity and character of our fruits and vegetables. Throughout most of human history, crop plants were adapted to local growing conditions and regional preferences. This resulted in tremendous diversity, not just between species but within them. Each region developed its own varieties of common crops, optimized for local soil, climate, pests, and culinary traditions. The Mediterranean region, for instance, developed olive varieties suited to its hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. Northern Europe selected for apple varieties that could withstand cold winters and ripen in short growing seasons. Different regions of Asia developed distinct varieties of rice adapted to local growing conditions and culinary preferences. This regional adaptation created a rich tapestry of crop diversity, with thousands of locally adapted varieties of common food plants. However, the globalization of agriculture in the 20th and 21st centuries has disrupted this pattern of regional diversity. Commercial agriculture increasingly relies on a small number of crop varieties that can be grown across wide geographic areas and meet standardized market demands. These varieties are often selected for their ability to perform adequately under a range of conditions rather than excelling in specific environments. Modern shipping allows fruits and vegetables to be transported thousands of miles, meaning they no longer need to be grown near where they're consumed. This has led to the concentration of production in regions with favorable growing conditions and lower costs, regardless of distance from markets. These changes have led to a significant loss of crop diversity. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that approximately 75% of plant genetic diversity has been lost as farmers worldwide have abandoned local varieties in favor of genetically uniform, high-yielding varieties. This loss of diversity represents not just a cultural loss, but a potential threat to food security. Genetic uniformity makes our food system more vulnerable to pests, diseases, and climate change. When many farmers grow the same varieties, a single pathogen or environmental stress can affect a large portion of the global food supply. Fortunately, there are efforts to preserve crop diversity. Seed banks like the Svalbard Global Seed Vault conserve samples of thousands of crop varieties. Community seed-saving networks maintain local varieties that might otherwise be lost. And there's growing interest in participatory plant breeding, where farmers and scientists work together to develop new varieties adapted to local conditions and needs. The globalization of our food system has brought benefits in terms of year-round availability and reduced seasonal scarcity. But it has also homogenized our food experience and reduced the deep connection between crops, local environments, and cultural traditions that characterized agriculture for most of human history. As we look to the future, the challenge will be to balance the benefits of global food systems with the preservation and renewal of crop diversity. Finding ways to maintain the rich variety of food plants that generations of farmers have developed while meeting the needs of a growing global population. Let's now consider the emerging field of ethnobotany, the study of how different cultures use plants and what it teaches us about the diversity of relationships between humans and food plants around the world. While our discussion has focused primarily on European agricultural traditions and their global spread, it's important to recognize that diverse cultures worldwide have developed their own approaches to plant domestication and cultivation, resulting in unique food plants and agricultural systems. Indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin, for instance, have domesticated hundreds of fruit and nut species that remain largely unknown outside their region. These include fruits like the cupuaçu, bacuri, and acai that have only recently begun to enter global markets. Many more remain local specialties, adapted to specific ecological niches and cultural preferences. Traditional farmers in the highlands of Peru and Bolivia maintain thousands of potato varieties, each adapted to specific growing conditions and culinary uses. This diversity serves as both cultural heritage and practical adaptation to the challenging mountain environment, where conditions can vary dramatically over small distances. In Southeast Asia, communities have developed sophisticated systems for cultivating hundreds of varieties of rice, each with specific characteristics suited to local growing conditions and culinary traditions. These varieties aren't simply distinguished by yield or basic cooking properties, but by subtle differences in flavor, aroma, and texture that are deeply embedded in regional cuisines. African farmers have domesticated unique grain crops like fonio, teff, and finger millet that thrive in challenging environments and provide nutritional security in regions where major global crops might struggle. These grains represent thousands of years of agricultural knowledge and adaptation to specific ecological contexts. These diverse agricultural traditions offer valuable lessons for contemporary food systems. They demonstrate approaches to resilience, sustainability, and nutrition that have been developed through generations of careful observation and adaptation. As climate change creates new challenges for agriculture worldwide, these diverse food plants and cultivation techniques may provide crucial resources for adaptation. Crops that can thrive in heat, drought, or flooding may become increasingly important as global weather patterns shift. The study of ethnobotany reminds us that the transformation of wild plants into food crops hasn't followed a single path, but many, with each cultural tradition developing unique approaches based on local environments, knowledge systems, and values. By recognizing and valuing this diversity of relationships between humans and food plants, we gain a richer understanding of our agricultural heritage and more tools for addressing contemporary food challenges. The story of plant domestication isn't just a European story or even a global story. It's thousands of interlinked stories, each with valuable insights to offer. As we conclude our exploration of the transformation of produce from medieval times to the present, let's reflect on the remarkable journey of our food plants and consider what it tells us about human creativity, adaptability, and our relationship with the natural world. The fruits and vegetables we eat today are the result of a multi-millennial collaboration between humans and plants. What began as small, often unpalatable wild species have been gradually transformed into the nutritious, delicious foods that sustain us today. This transformation represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, a quiet revolution that has unfolded across countless generations, dramatically increasing our food supply and changing what we eat, how we live, and who we are as a species. The story of plant domestication reveals the remarkable plasticity of plant forms under human selection. The fact that a single wild species, Brassica oleracea, could be transformed into vegetables as diverse as cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, kohlrabi, and Brussels sprouts demonstrates the extraordinary potential for change that exists within plant genomes. It also highlights the power of human observation, patience, and innovation. For most of agricultural history, farmers were working without any scientific understanding of genetics or plant physiology. They were guided by careful observation, practical knowledge passed down through generations, and a deep connection to the plants they cultivated. As we face contemporary challenges like climate change, population growth, and environmental degradation, this history of plant transformation offers both lessons and resources. The genetic diversity, preserved in thousands of crop varieties, developed for different environments and purposes, represents a crucial toolkit for adaptation to changing conditions. Modern scientific understanding of plant genetics, combined with the wealth of traditional agricultural knowledge developed across diverse cultures, provides unprecedented opportunities to continue the improvement of our food plants, not just for yield and convenience, but for nutrition, sustainability, and resilience. Yet as we continue this process of transformation, we would do well to remember that our food plants are not just commodities, but living connections to our history and culture. The fruits and vegetables on our plates tell stories of human migration, cultural exchange, technological innovation, and creative adaptation to diverse environments. By appreciating this rich history, we gain not just practical knowledge but a deeper connection to our food, an understanding that even the most ordinary apple or carrot represents thousands of years of human creativity and care, a living legacy passed down through countless generations. So the next time you bite into a piece of fruit or enjoy a serving of vegetables, remember you're tasting thousands of years of human history and innovation. What seems simple and ordinary on your plate is actually the result of one of humanity's longest and most successful collaborations with the natural world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, carrying these stories of transformation with you, perhaps you'll see the fruits and vegetables in your kitchen with new eyes tomorrow, not just as food, but as testament to human ingenuity and our enduring partnership with the plants that sustain us.